now being recorded.
According to Bowlby, attachment, or the profound sense of emotional safety and security, develops during infancy and has effects throughout the individual's lifespan and her or his relationships with others. None of this is surprising, considering attachment is anchored in the evolutionary imperative of survival. Attachment develops from early and recurring experiences with the primary caregiver, usually the mother, and involves a deep sense of safety and security when within proximity of the attachment figure. The internal working models, which are the heart of attachment, are mental representations concerning expectations and beliefs about the attachment figure's accessibility and responsiveness, and these are subsequently transferred to other individuals during development, ensuring continuity over time and settings in relationships with others.
Excuse me, Margie.
Yes?
I'm sorry to cut you off, but there are a number of people who have not muted their phones, so aside from you, some of our listeners. So if you're a listener, please press *6, or if you're on a speaker, please simply hit your mute button. Thank you. Back to you, Margie.
Okay. Well, let me see if I could catch my breath here a second and jump right back into this. I was saying the internal working models or mental representations concerning expectations and beliefs about the attachment figure's accessibility and responsiveness are subsequently transferred to other individuals during development, ensuring continuity over time and settings in relationships with others. They also shape the internal working model of the self, that is, the individual's sense of self-worth. Internal working models of self and others, as positive or negative, are forged early in life. There are several patterns to attachment. The securely attached child has an accessible and responsive caregiver who is available when needed by the child. The sense of security engendered by such a caregiver allows the child to regulate emotion, explore the environment, become self-reliant in an age-appropriate manner, and feel positive about both the self and caregiver. The opposite characterizes the relationship of the insecurely attached child to the caregiver. Such a child has a caregiver who is inaccessible, unresponsive, intrusive, abusive, or erratic to such an extent that the child follows one of two insecure attachment patterns. First, the child avoids or dismisses the caregiver, maintaining the caregiver at a distance, becoming compulsively self-reliant, and regulating emotion even when contraindicated. The child depends on the self, given the unavailable caregiver. Thus, the child has positive feelings about the self, but negative feelings about the caregiver. Second, the child is preoccupied with the caregiver in an anxious or resistant manner, meaning a distressed or aroused manner. The child is vigilant about the caregiver and seeks out the caregiver. However, ambivalence toward the caregiver is evident by the distress experienced when reunited with the caregiver. The anxious, resistant, or ambivalent child has strong positive feelings about the caregiver, but negative feelings about the self. Attachment patterns arise from the exchange between the child and primary caregiver, as I said earlier, and affect the way the child regulates emotional arousal and copes with stress, as proposed by Bowlby, first demonstrated by Ainsworth's experimental paradigm restraint situation procedure, and subsequently shown by other experimental and longitudinal studies. Attachment, meaning the patterns or styles of attachment established during infancy, affects the individual throughout the lifespan and in multiple domains of functioning, including health. Attachment scaffolds the individual's continued development, or it provides vulnerabilities that will be carried forward. As mentioned earlier, the individual's attachment indicates how she or he is likely to cope with stress because the attachment system is engaged during stress, as Ainsworth demonstrated. Thus, attachment has implications for health and adaptation by means of coping styles and emotion regulation, as has also been demonstrated by studying health and functioning under such severe stress as, for example, being within a few blocks of the World Trade Center during the 9/11 attack. Such longitudinal studies demonstrate that individuals with secure attachment are resilient in the face of stress, whereas those with insecure attachment are vulnerable to poor health, adaptation, and functioning in multiple domains. With all of this in mind, let me now turn to attachment in LGB individuals by noting that although too little research has been done on the attachment of LGB individuals, the theoretical and empirical literature on attachment that I just reviewed very briefly is expected to generalize to them. Attachment has important implications for understanding the health and adaptation of LGB individuals in a number of ways. First, how LGB individuals manage the challenges of their sexual identity development is a function of their attachment. How LGB individuals cope with gay-related or minority stress is also a function of attachment. Attachment will be critical for determining whether the individual will be resilient or vulnerable when confronted with all forms of stress, including minority stress. Consequently, it is imperative to understand the strengths and vulnerabilities that LGB individuals bring to their sexual identity development and experiences of minority stress. Attachment is one developmental process that has much to say about these matters. In the article that I have in the forthcoming issue of Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, which is expected to come out in September, I propose a model of how attachment affects the health and adaptation of LGB individuals. The model details the potential and vulnerability that LGB individuals bring to their sexual identity development and experiences of minority stress. It emphasizes the need for future research on LGB individuals to consider developmental process with respect to their past experiences and future possible outcomes, that it meets these objectives while being sensitive to social factors that may affect or interact with attachment. So I will leave you with that, and I will turn this over to the next presenter, Dr. Tran, I believe.
Great, thank you. All right. Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Alicia Tran, and I'm an assistant professor in counseling and counseling psychology at Arizona State University. And the research I'm going to share today is aimed at conceptualizing how neighborhood environments may serve as protective factors for lesbian, gay, and minorities to counter an external stressor, specifically discrimination, as it relates to mental health. And I want to start us off with a quote. "Your next-door neighbor is not a man. He is an environment." Quote, because I thought it nicely reflected this idea of getting away from thinking about neighborhoods as physical places that we merely occupy, but instead as these meaningful spaces that can provide community, safety, material, and social supports, or unfortunately for some people, a lack thereof. And this is really an ecological perspective that considers context and the environment as having an influence on individual functioning and development. And even though many scientific fields have come to understand context does matter to human experience, the broader ecological system on an individual have received a lot less scholarly attention to individual factors such as personal characteristics or attitudes or values and so forth, and direct interpersonal processes such as how we interact directly with a parent or a friend. And so we really know a lot less about how contextual or environmental systems surrounding people may support resilience. And in this study, I adopt a view of resilience that's been discussed by Dr. Meyer and Dr. Rosario, where I view resilience and being resilient as having to be understood in the context of risk and adversity. So how do we at least do okay in spite of experiencing some adversity or being at risk? And there are numerous risk factors that Lgb individuals face. Among them, we know that Lgb minorities continue to disproportionately experience discrimination at higher rates than heterosexual individuals. And like other cultural minority groups, they also experience health disparities, including greater risk for psychological distress. And as Dr. Meyer's minority stress model pointed out earlier, this is presumably because of stressors uniquely experienced by the Lgb community, such as discrimination. So one of the things we know from the literature on both Lgb and non-Lgb individuals is that discrimination is consistently linked to poorer health. And this is one of the most consistent findings psychology has to offer. It's actually how consistent it is. And so to recap, we know from the literature that Lgb minorities are at greater risk for health disparities, including greater psychological distress. They also face a greater or disproportionate burden of social disparities, including discrimination. And in my study, indeed, that's what I found. Lgb individuals reported greater discrimination and psychological distress than the heterosexual samples. But I also found that they are at risk for lower percent. That's concerning because it suggests that Lgb individuals may be at risk for not feeling connected and safe within their neighborhood environments, and it points to another potential disparity that they may face. So now that we've talked a little bit about risk, let me talk about resilience. So thankfully, risk rarely has a one-to-one outcome. Actually suggests that a good proportion of Lgb individuals are well adapted in spite of being a group at risk. And so what I want to look at is if neighborhood quality could be a protective factor specifically for lesbian, gay, and bisexual minorities in a way that could counteract the risk for psychological distress that we associate with discrimination that is so consistently borne out in the research literature. So I used a countywide data set out of Minnesota that included items for self-reported neighborhood quality. And these items revolved around perceptions of it. And you can see some of the samples in the corner on the bottom left. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these sample items is that these are general neighborhood qualities and they're not necessarily specific to the Lgb experience. So they could be asked of both the Lgb and heterosexual respondents. Now, we do have some reason to believe forms should matter to Lgb communities specifically. For Lgb individuals, the social cohesion and safety in one's neighborhood may be especially meaningful within the context of discrimination, given the historical and continued current threat of isolation, harassment, and violence faced by many Lgb individuals within their local communities. So from a historical perspective, for instance, we might be reminded of the police raids of the Stonewall Inn in the mid-1900s, events that really did threats within a local for many individuals. And historically, Lgb cultural enclaves and non-biological social communities such as fictive kinship networks or non-biological families have been understood as distinct sources of resilience to counter social rejection and exclusion experienced by Lgb minorities. And so when I say I looked at perceived neighborhood quality as a protective factor against discrimination for Lgb individuals, I'm really emphasizing that there's potential to see a group-specific or a culturally relevant effect that we might not see for a heterosexual survey respondent. And the crux of what I found in trying to address this question can basically be summarized in these two figures. So let me walk us through what we're looking at. So in these figures, we're looking at the relationship between discrimination and psychological distress symptoms. And on the left, we have the results for heterosexual respondents, and on the right, we have the results for the Lgb sample. And the blue represents how the relationship between discrimination and psychological distress looks for individuals who perceived low neighborhood quality. And the green solid line represents how the relationship between discrimination and psychological distress looks for those who perceived high neighborhood quality. So for the respondents, what we is the positive and significant correlation between discrimination and psychological distress for those who perceived high and low neighborhood quality. And so I put that these are expected, and this is because this is consistent with what we've come to expect in the literature. More frequent experiences of discrimination is significantly associated with greater psychological distress. Now we see for those who perceive low quality in their neighborhoods, we see that the expected positive and significant correlation between discrimination and psychological distress is still present. But if you're an LGB respondent and you perceive high quality, that is more safety and more cohesion in your neighborhood environment, the connection that we've come to know quite well in the literature is nullified. And this points towards quality as a protective factor in the LGB sample specifically. And so I think these results are really in line with what Dr. Meyer was saying earlier about drawing on community resources and having community resources as a protective factor. And I think this reflects the power of LGB individuals to draw on their social and community supports and resources specifically to counteract discrimination. And if we recall that neighborhood quality was represented by items that reflected the sense of safety and cohesion people feel in their neighborhood, it's possible general social support or community acceptance that an individual feels in their local community. And it really pushes about how we can bolster the quality, acceptance, and support in people's environment. And the broader implications that this has for stress resilience theories is that it reinforces that it is possible to disrupt the discrimination psychological distress link, particularly by considering the environment surrounding an individual. And in my paper, I label perceived neighborhood quality as a potential culturally relevant protective factor, and I want to emphasize the cultural specificity I found behind this effect. And so speaking in very strong terms here, perceived neighborhood quality really didn't for the heterosexual in terms of offsetting discrimination and its psychological effects. But it appeared like it was quite impactful for those LGB individuals who specifically experienced high neighborhood quality and reflected that in their responses. So it may suggest that LGB in their neighborhoods as a psychological resource differently than heterosexual individuals are. And ultimately, it reminds us of the capacity for resilience that's implemented in the LGB community, despite this group technically being an at-risk group. And this gets us to think about neighbors as both sources of stress that can replicate systems of oppression, but also as environmental sources of well-being and resilience for LGB individuals, consistent with what Dr. Meyer said earlier about community resources. And for those of us who do clinical training or work directly with these communities, it's a good reminder to assess perceptions of neighborhood quality and not take this particular environment for granted. Overall, I would say this reflects the power of the ecological context, and at a big picture level, it could have policy implications and push us to work towards policies that address perceptions of how safe or cohesive our environments are, such as hate crime laws that protect LGBT individuals and may promote their sense of cohesion and safety. And so thank you very much. It's been an honor. Here's my contact information, and I look forward to having this research out there in the forthcoming special issue to really emphasize the capacity for resilience in the LGBT community. Turn it over to Dr. Heck.
So thanks everybody, and thanks Dr. Tran. Today I'm going to be discussing the results of a very preliminary pilot project that I conducted last year to assess the feasibility and accept the mental health promotion program being gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer adolescents. This is a program that I've been working to develop over the past few years. And so with that being said, it fits my overarching goal for my program of research, which is to disrupt the minority stress, psychiatric distress relationship. And so using Atzenbuehler in 2009 identified mediators in the relationship between experiencing minority stress, specifically prejudice, and psychiatric distress. These mediators include emotion dysregulation, social isolation, and negative self-esteem. So knowing that some of the core cognitive behavioral interventions for anxiety and depression, which include teaching affect regulation skills and problem, as well as teaching cognitive coping or cognitive restructuring skills, I found myself to develop a program that would promote positive mental health outcomes for LGBTQ youth. And I thought that if such a program could be developed to help adolescents their emotions and to seek out support in the face of stress and to think about their goal in the face of stress, then perhaps this could foster resilience among a demographic that we consider to be at risk for developing a host of negative health outcomes. And this makes me think back to when I was an undergraduate student and I read an article in the American Psychologist by Philip Zimbardo, and it contained a quote from former American Association President George Miller that encouraged psychologists to, quote, give away psychology to the public. And this idea has resonated with me since I started graduate school, and it's often been in the back of my head as I was learning to provide psychotherapy services to individuals and families. So throughout my graduate and postdoctoral training, I've found myself continuing to want to develop a program that could foster positive for LGBTQ youth and do so in a way that capitalizes on what we know about psychology while also being something that has the potential to be disseminated on a large scale. And those are pretty ambitious goals for a graduate student. And so at that time, I found myself spending a bit more time conducting research on clubs for LGBTQ youth, clubs that are often called gay straight student alliances. And due to this research, I was often invited to speak at Gay Straight Alliance meetings. And when preparing for those talks and more broadly during graduate school, I was really at a place where we knew a lot about risk factors, but we didn't really know much about factors or things that might mitigate the effects of minority stress and foster resilience. And so, while speaking at these Gay Straight Alliance meetings, I often got asked questions about depression, anxiety, substance use, and self-injurious behaviors, and I ended up finding myself providing basic psychoeducation about these topics, and then facilitating conversations about how others that are unique to their identities. And these conversations started to inform my thinking about program design. And by the time I got around to starting my postdoctoral training, I'd presented at enough high school Gay Straight Alliance meetings and facilitated enough conversations around the topic of stress and coping that I basically had a session that I thought might help LGBTQ youth more effectively cope with stressors like coming out or being bullied or experiencing peer rejection. With more and more high schools having some form of club for LGBTQ youth and their friends, this made me think that if I could develop a program that was effective and could be delivered by the Gay Straight Alliance advisor, I might actually be able to develop something that could promote resilience among this demographic on a large scale. I also thought that given the absence of effective programs specifically designed to promote positive mental health outcomes among LGBTQ, perhaps the Gay Straight Alliance setting could be a great vehicle to not only deliver such programming, but it could also provide access to the difficult-to-reach population that I needed in order to develop programs that might be delivered through other mediums, like the internet or through LGBT community centers. I was starting to get ahead of myself, and so I scaled back and started to actually outline a protocol that I felt would be of interest to LGBTQ youth, feasible to implement within the Gay Straight Alliance setting, and potentially beneficial. So, turning to that now, here is a brief overview of the program session. And the first session starts off by providing psychoeducation and talking about minority stress and general stress, with the goal of helping adolescents recognize that elevated rates of psychological distress reported among LGBTQ youth are not the result of some characterological defect, but rather the result of experiencing additional stressors that their non-LGBTQ peers do not have to experience. So I often pose the question to students that if there are unique stress, perhaps there are unique ways LGBTQ youth can cope with those stressors. In the second session, we discuss affect regulation skills with the goal of helping the participants learn to identify specific emotions, to quantify the intensity of those emotions, and to reduce excessive emotionality or dysregulation. And we do this by talking about emotional responses that individuals have experienced in relation to past minority stressors. Participants learn about the connections between thoughts, feelings, and actions. But we also focus a lot on how LGBTQ youth can identify skills that they would like to achieve when confronted with minority stressors. The example I often use, and that came from one of these meetings with students at a Gay Straight Alliance, is what would your goal or goals be if you got to school one morning and found that someone had written a homophobic slur on your locker? Once the goal is identified, we discuss how to think, feel, and act in ways that move an individual closer to their goal or goals. Using the locker example, if the goal is to get the slur off the locker, then thinking, who did this? I bet Blake Thompson did it. I should go punch his lights out, probably isn't going to move the person toward their goal. Thus, this skill doesn't impose goals upon the participants. It simply helps them to think about what they want to have occur when they're experiencing a form of stress, and gives them a method to examine whether their thoughts, feelings, and actions are moving them closer to, or perhaps away from, their goal or goals. In the fourth session, we focus on how to systematically solve problems, pros and cons, in order to make informed decisions about when to disclose or conceal one's sexual or gender minority status. So overall, I had this protocol, and it seemed like a great start to me. I felt like I could make a strong case to my postdoctoral mentor for why this was a worthwhile endeavor. I liked the idea of the program because the participants would be learning skills within the same ecological system where they were very likely to encounter minorities. I also thought that if an effective program could be developed and integrated into the school setting, then LGBTQ youth who are not out to their parents might be valuable skills unnecessarily having to come out to their parents. And finally, I was reflecting back on the time I had spent as a predoctoral intern working on an adolescent inpatient unit in South Carolina. And what I'd noticed while I was there is that at any given point in time, in our unit of 15 to 20 teens, there was always one or more LGBTQ patients as a result of a suicide attempt or serious substance use problem. Thus, it was my hope that if I could find a way to embed some form of programming into the social environment, then perhaps a few of these teens could be reached before things got out of hand. So, when I told my postdoc mentor that I'd developed a program that I wanted to try and deliver within the context of a school club for LGBTQ youth in order to teach them new ways to cope with stressors that are unique to their sexual and gender minority statuses, he was at first very skeptical, and he might have even encouraged me to set that project aside and start analyzing some existing data. But I persisted, and he finally said he'd support my project if I could conduct a pilot study where I implemented and obtained student feedback about each program session that I had laid out. So I went out, I found a school with a Gay Straight Alliance, obtained IRB approval to conduct the pilot, and had 10 GSA members participate in the study. I provided some basic demographic information about the participants on the slide, but generally I found I was able to reach the members of my target population and recruit them into the study. So we held the study at the end of the school year in the final weeks, and the study session during regular GSA meetings. And we had 10 GSA members from the school who were willing to participate, and 6 of those 10 were consistently attending GSA meetings over the course of the year. And so between 5 and 7 participants attended each program session, and after each session they completed a 13-item session-level feedback form. Some example of the items from the feedback form are presented along with the mean scores from the students who attended each session. The items were rated on a 5-point scale from 0 to 4, with higher scores indicating greater agreement with the statement. Generally, participants viewed the program sessions in order. 3 of the items were open-ended, and again, the feedback was positive. The suggestions I received were that I allocate more time for participant-directed discussion, increase the relevance of the sessions for straight allies, and create additional activities or games to use as part of the program. So having conducted the pilot study, I began the process of revising the program to include more real-life examples of how the skills could be beneficial for LGBTQ youth. For example, we revised the disclosure decision-making session to include an activity where participants read a brief biography of Billy Beane, a Major League Baseball player who remained closeted during his time playing. The biography describes the challenges associated with keeping secret one's LGBTQ identity, the potential risks of coming out, and just how difficult it can be to evaluate how other people might respond when learning that a close friend or coworker is gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. We're also working to make the protocol more relevant to straight allies and to use the straight allies who are part of GSAs as a source of support for the GSA members. We're planning to run another pilot study using our revised protocol to demonstrate that we can scale up the research to the level that would be necessary to actually evaluate whether the program has the potential to disrupt the minority stress psychiatric distress relationship. And just recently, my research lab finished collecting data from about 60 GSA advisors in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa in order to better understand how such a program could be integrated into the GSA setting and to hopefully ensure that the program components could be delivered by actual GSA advisors in the future. So finally, it's important that I mention that this was a pilot study. It was not an open or randomized controlled trial. There was no control group. Until we replicate and scale up the research, we can't know whether a program like this could be repeated or if it could even be effective. And so I should make those points clear. And then I'd like to finally thank Dr. Meyer and the staff at NIH who organized this webinar, as well as my co-presenters. And I'd also like to thank my postdoctoral mentor, Larry Brown, for his invaluable support and guidance as I conducted the initial pilot study. And that's it.
Thank you, Alicia, Margie, and Ilan. We have a question from Carla Anhalt for Nick. What was your human subjects protection process for your pilot project?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
Certainly. What was your consent process for your pilot project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the students all gave their own assent if they were under 18 or consent verbally if they were over 18. And there was parental permission was waived for this particular study.
Okay, thank you. Catherine Massey would like to know from you, Alicia, how did you define neighborhood quality? Did LGB participants have or not have access to LGBT resources within or close to their homes? It'd be a perfect slide with those examples.
Great, thank you. That's a really good question. And so I jump back to that slide. Thank you for pointing that out. And so here are some examples of the items that participants responded to. And so these were self-reports of the qualities of their neighborhood. And the items really got around the sense of social cohesion that they have in their neighborhood, like if their neighbors can be trusted, as well as issues around safety, if they feel safe for children, if people are afraid to go out at night due to violence.
Were there any, did you have, I think I'm going to follow up, I'm going to channel Catherine and ask, did you have any questions that, from the battery that was generalizable to a larger population? Did you have any questions that said things like, my neighborhood has people like me, those sorts of things, or there are taverns, clubs, social places where I can hang out. I think perhaps that's what she's talking about when she says LGBT resources.
Right, yeah, no, and so these are very general questions, so they could be asked of everyone in the survey, and so unfortunately they didn't have LGB-specific experiences within them in terms of specific LGB resources and also a sense of affinity and overlap with the LGB experience. So unfortunately, no. I think that's important, though, in really understanding the unique resources and how supplying those resources can have a lot of meaning to resilience and possibly maybe more than general neighborhood quality. It would be a great research question, a great way to follow this up.
Okay, so do you see yourself developing LGB-specific neighborhood measures and test them for reliability and validity versus the larger measures?
It's a really good thought. I think that it would be a valuable measure. And I'm trying to think if I can think of any off the top of my head. It would be something that would be fantastic to do because it really does get at what programs can we implement, what communities, what safe communities might look like for diverse groups. Not just, I know I looked at just lesbian, gay, and bisexual respondents in this study, but also transgender individuals. And so I'd love to be able to do that at some point in the future.
Okay, thanks. Danielle Reed, says, great work. What were the desired and anticipated outcomes? But I'm not. I need you, Danielle, to clarify to whom you'd like that question to go to. Joshua has a question for Nick. Are you proposing future experimental pre- and post-test designs with a control group and randomized assignment to conditions?
Yeah, so that's going to be our next step. And our control group will actually just be considering like the Gay-Straight Alliance as a control group without inserting any kind of additional mental health promotion programming. And so we're planning on, as we build up to this, looking at somewhere between 8 and 12 high school GSAs where we would do a crossover design in the future. And so that's kind of where things are at now. We're this fall hoping to pilot the revised protocol in just one GSA, but eventually hoping to scale up a little bit further to see if the actual components of the program will have any impact on the mediators that exist between experiencing minority stress and developing psychiatric distress. But that's a great question.
And that was a great answer, Nick.
Thanks.
Laura Shalaha, for you, Alicia, recommends that you look at several measures for, especially for ethnic minority groups, that already adapt them. Thanks for that, Laura. Danielle's question is for the high school project. So, sorry to keep picking on you, Nick, but Danielle wants to know what your desired and anticipated outcomes were.
So, if in fact emotion dysregulation, social isolation, and maladaptive self-schemas are key mediators between the relationship of minority stress and psychiatric distress, our goal for the actual intervention would be to see that the components, or the goal for the program would be to see that the components kind of bolster those key mediators. In other words, help individuals be better at regulating their emotions, help individuals be better at seeking out support when experiencing stress, and then help individuals change the way that they think about themselves and their sort of experience within their environment, to ideally reach a place where they're able to navigate the stress that they may be experiencing in such a way that it doesn't have take a toll on their mental health. So I think about the program as really trying to modify some of those key mediators, with the goal being that if we do that, then ideally we should be promoting more favorable health outcomes in the long run.
Thanks so much, Nick. Jorge Soler has a question for you, Margie, Dr. Rosario. What are the implications for thinking about attachment, if any, when primary caregivers are defined as something other than biological parents? For example, chosen family, or if it's only the mother or father versus having both parents.
I'm going to ask you to just repeat that very briefly because I had to unmute my phone or mute it or something like that. So could you just very quickly repeat your question?
Of course. What are the implications, thinking about attachment, what are the implications when primary caregivers are someone other than the immediate biological parents? For example, a single mother or a single father. Jorge's example is chosen family. What implications do you see there?
The implications are the same so long as we have involved with that other, whoever that other is, that other has all the characteristics that we expect from an attachment figure, and that is someone who is near the individual physically and for whom the individual feels a deep sense, and I mean a really deep sense of safety and security. That is what defines attachment. We usually think of it in terms of the mother because that is a typical attachment figure, but it could be anyone. It doesn't have to be the mother. It could be a grandparent. It could be someone else individual in the individual's life. And then subsequently, that is transferred to other individuals as development progresses. And what we find in adulthood is that the attachment figure, for the most part, tends to become the individual's romantic partner, although not all romantic partners are attachment figures. And one can have, for example, a friend could be an attachment figure. And it changes even further as we enter the later years of life, the elderly years of life. So the key is what we mean by attachment, which is someone who serves as a safe haven and a safety person for the individual. So it could be anyone.
Okay, so you're saying that this significant person who can influence attachment can exist over the entire life course. And so we may become attached to people over our entire lives who may be able to have a positive or unfortunately negative influence on one's resilience to stress?
We have attachment, as Bowlby said, from cradle to grave. I mean, and that was his actual expression. It's something that is developed in infancy, and we take it to our grave with us. Now, what happens with development is that the attachment figure changes over time. It's usually the mother for most people, but even in childhood, it could be someone else. And then it gradually changes as development changes to become a romantic partner. And then oftentimes later on in life, in the elderly years, it becomes actually one's own offspring as spouses and friends, precede one to death. And that has implications, that last part, for Lgb individuals, because a lot of Lgb individuals do not have children. And that's something that we need to start thinking about, and we need to start really doing some research on elderly Lgb individuals, more so than what we have done, which is really relatively little. But yeah, I mean, attachment is with us from cradle to grave. It does change, and I get into those kind of finer points in the paper because they are kind of fine points and they need some detail to explain. But the key is that the attachment figure is someone with whom we have a very deep sense of safety and security, and that is what allows then for a lot of the exploration and attachment to take place and the like.
That's just perfect. Thanks so much. Alexander Moreno has a question for you, Alicia. Could you please talk about the relationship between culture and neighborhood quality perception, where heterosexuals and were heterosexuals and LGBs comparable in terms of income? And just filling in for Alexander, perhaps other socioeconomic variables as well, not just income.
No, they weren't actually, and so I did some analyses that controlled for the relationship between discrimination and psychological distress when we control for things like socioeconomic status and education, because there were those group differences, and the results held when I controlled for those variables. The results also mirrored the same pattern when I looked at just lesbian and just gay respondents as well, and so it was robust finding across the specific groups as well as when controlling for those variables. But it was a notable finding that even though the LGB sample, they actually reported higher levels of socioeconomic status and higher levels of education than the heterosexual sample, even though they in theory have these surface level material resources. It's really consistent with other research findings that really emphasize that there's risk to individuals. And so this may be a group level trend where we find these higher socioeconomic resources, but still considering at the individual level, there are still individual experiences of things like discrimination, limitations in work opportunities, and barriers to excelling in their jobs and getting promotions, those kind of things. And so it's a really good reminder that even if we think about those things as resources, they may not actually translate that way. Of course, that wasn't what the study was about, so I can't say definitively in terms of data, but it's an interesting to note, and I really appreciate that you're thinking about that because it was something that emerged as notable in the sample, and hopefully I'm addressing the crux of that question.
Thank you. Jane Harmon has a very helpful reference to an NIH-funded cohort study that has many different banks of questions regarding social stress, neighborhood quality, and coping mechanisms, the Jackson Hart study. I think I have I typed it incorrectly? Or here? Okay, I've just sent that. Well, actually, it comes out after under Nana's name. That's the Jackson Hart study is an African-American, focuses on African-Americans in the Deep South. It's Jackson, Mississippi, but that gets to quite a number of the questions that we've gotten about how this relates to other minority groups. And that this is open to to you all, Alicia, you looked at neighborhood quality. We all have learned so much from predecessors as well as Elon's model of minority stress. Have any of you looked at the significance or frequency of migration and whether people left their homes and migrated to other environments because of their sexual minority status?
I haven't, but I know some people have done that. I mean, one of the things about thinking about community is that, in fact, people can get up and leave their communities. If communities are, for whatever reason, toxic, a lot of people can leave those toxic environments. It's not like some experiment where you're kind of stuck in the experiment. That makes for some interesting thought about what what is going on causally when we talk about communities. So there's probably some kind of bidirectional relationship that exists, so that a community has both push and pull factors, attractors and detractors for an individual, and an individual can get up and leave, or a whole community can get up and leave. I mean, I'm outside of New York City, and we've had gay neighborhoods that are no longer gay in New York City. Where did all the gay people go? Well, they moved on to other communities. So you could have that, at the individual level, but even at the level of community, leaving places and going to other places that might be seen as more hospitable for a group of people.
Yeah, and I haven't looked at that myself either, but the research does suggest that that's a common, or at least not an uncommon, coping strategy for some individuals to usually go towards urban centers that, particularly from rural areas. That said, there are some groups, for instance, adolescents and youth, who may not be able to leave their community immediately. And so it's a really important question that you're posing there, and thinking about how voluntary or involuntary their residence in that neighborhood or community is, because I think that's a very relevant, important factor in shaping those perceptions, as well as the risk for experiencing things like discrimination. It's a great question.
Okay. Thank you both. Ilan, you're, of course, not only are you at UCLA, but you are, your main appointment is at the Williams Institute in the College of Law. Juan Garcia is wondering what your and perhaps everyone else's thoughts are on about the impact of more macro-level approaches in resilience and mental health of the LGBT community. And one specific example is policy approaches. Do you, Ilan, or any of the rest of you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked this question, because I thought it was a really important question that Juan Garcia asked. And I wanted to bring back to where I was in my presentation, the slide that looked at the intervention levels. And I think one of the mistakes that sometimes we do is that we focus only on one part of this or any kind of model and think about individual or upstream and downstream, as we call it in public health. And I really wanted to stress that importance of focusing not only on any one type. Of course, everybody doesn't focus on everything, but as a group, we need to focus on everything. And that's why I like the papers today that really point out to very different aspects of the stress model, all the way from very individual to neighborhood to educational intervention. And of course, the question here was about policies. You would say those are immensely important to change, and I mentioned before marriage equality, but again, this is one example out of many of how laws and policies impact the lives of LGBT people. But I just want to add one more thing, that there is sometimes the distinction between the levels of intervention are a little bit artificial, because if you think, for example, about NICS intervention, the high school intervention, in some ways you can think of it as an individual intervention, because you're going and talking almost as a kind of group therapy or psychoeducation session that you're addressing individual people. But on the other level, you can think of it as a policy issue if you begin to think about how schools will implement such a intervention, whether they would allow or not allow, or what debates will be in various schools about allowing such interventions in a high school. And then if you go even further up, there are legal issues there. For example, I don't know how many people are familiar with the so-called no homo promo laws in some, I think right now 9 or 11 states that have laws that would make it illegal to do interventions such as NIC in a high school because it's illegal to discuss anything about lesbian, gay, bisexual issues. So I think you can see that in many areas that you touch on, there's really a broad range of levels of intervention, even if you think that you're doing one specific thing.
Thanks. For you, Ilan, or perhaps any of you, since you're all on college campuses, do you see the utility or how these interventions might be adapted or implemented among college or technical school youth who are legal adults rather than in high school? I know Catherine Massey says that it's definitely needed on college campuses as well.
Well, you know, that's absolutely correct about the college campuses. I'll turn this over to Nick in a second. The work by GLSEN in New York has clearly tracked that it's not just an issue for high schools, but that college campuses can also be a pretty toxic environment for LGB students as well as faculty. But Nick, this is your area.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that can be done at the high school level, and I think we're also seeing some great work, John Pachankas's work in doing very similar sort of adaptation research and looking at trying to apply kind of a similar minority stress framework to adapting interventions for gay and bisexual men. So I think we're really seeing the beginning of taking what we know about psychotherapy and psychological interventions and programs and tailoring those to the unique needs of LGBT individuals. And I personally think we need a lot more of that because it's something in my mind that is where we need to be going.
Great. That's we've run a bit over our time, and although we could spend all afternoon talking over cyberspace, we need to let many people get back to their lives. Let me thank all four of you again for all the time that you put in advance for this webinar, as well as your intellect and effort to create the slides. Everyone's time today for participating. If when you registered for this webinar you included your email address, please know that we will send you the slides as soon the slide set as soon as we can. As a federal agency, we do follow the Section 508 compliance of the American for Disabilities Act. So once we have our slides compliant with that and a transcript of our speakers' comments, we will make this archived presentation available to the entire public through our web presence. If you have additional questions, our four presenters did provide their contact information. You're also welcome to contact Dr. Isabel Estrada, whose email message is on the form, or me, william.elwood@nih.gov. Thank you all so very much, and congratulations to our speakers, and thanks for your fine work. Good afternoon. Bye.